My name is Bob Davis. I received a PhD in neuroscience too long ago, but I retired approximately 10 years ago, and since then I've had several experiences. One which was a shared death experience. You see, I was ready to retire into a relaxing remaining years of my life, but I had many experiences that moved me in a different direction. One was a shared death experience, which, if you don't mind, I'd like to mention. I awoke one cold morning, it was about 6:30 a.m., from a very realistic, horrific lucid dream. I sensed that I was suffocating to death. It was hyper real, and it left me with a very strong sense of knowing that Anne, who was a very close and dear friend and colleague who worked at my research laboratory for over 20 years, had died. And I was shook by that incident. As I was driving to work that morning, I kept on thinking about how horrific it was. Not thinking about the death of Anne, because during my shared death experience, I received a knowingness that she had died. I just knew it, but I didn't consider it because it was so far-fetched at the time, until I walked down the hall, approached my laboratory door, turned the key, opened it up, and saw the teary eyes of my colleagues, and I knew right then and there what had happened. Anne had passed away at the same time that I had my near-death experience. And reconstructing the incident of that unforgettable morning made it apparent that there were many unusual and simultaneously occurring events arguing against it as a random event. One thing is that I only recall having a few nightmares as a child that seemed real in hindsight, but far from being hyper-realistic as this was. And I never had a nightmare since childhood, and never dreamed of dying and having sensed information of knowing this from another person during a dreamlike state that actually foretold the future. It's like clairvoyance. So collectively, the chances of these events occurring on the same day and time of my close friend's death was beyond remote. So with this clearly in mind, I felt compelled to research and write about the concept of life after death. So I wrote the book, Life After Death, an analysis of the evidence. But then I had a Kundalini awakening. It's an energetic, spiritual awakening. A woman was sending intention to me, telling me to clean the negative entities, negative engrams out of my body. And while she was doing that, my body began to shake violently, uncontrollably, as if I had no control over it. And if you ever watched the movie The Exorcist, I was behaving in a wild manner like Reagan when she was possessed by the devil. But at the same time that my body was contorting, as if I was suffering, as it appeared to an observer who was watching my body at the time, I was feeling nothing but bliss. And I kept on doing this. Give me more. Give me more. I didn't know what she was doing, but she was sending some type of intention to me that felt absolutely energetically magnificent. It was blissful. But at the same time, again, I was observing my body doing something completely different, and I had no control over it. So I had this sense of duality between my mind, consciousness, and body. This distinct, independent relationship between the two. And that led me to write my next book, Unseen Forces, an integration of science, reality, and you. That was picked up by a producer, and 4 years later we have a film called The Consciousness Connection, which can be found on consciousness.media, also on Amazon Video. And this book, Unseen Forces, served as the foundation, essentially, of the need for a paradigm shift. I wrote another book just recently, also called The Consciousness Connection, Extraordinary Human Experiences and the Nature of Reality. again calling for the need for a paradigm shift, because our current materialistic paradigm doesn't answer questions about near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, energetic Kundalini awakenings like I had. It's not designed to answer these questions. Newtonian physics is not designed to do that. It's purely 1 and 1 equals 2. Evidence is quantitative. It's not qualitative. We don't use a subjective experience, which is unfortunate, because that's what we need in order to better understand near-death experiences, especially veridical perceptions, which more than anything are the jewels of research in near-death experiences, which are conclusively proved to me that these events are real. And during the interview for our film, The Consciousness Connection, we interviewed Bruce Grayson. Some members of your audience may know him. He's a leading NDE researcher and psychiatrist, and he relayed to us a story one time of a veridical perception, or a verifiable perception, meaning that somebody who has an NDE, near-death experience, receives information only for it to be corroborated by an independent party. And that person who had an NDE should not have been aware of that information given the comatose state. Here, for instance, Bruce Grayson shared this event with us, and it's in our film. One of the people he interviewed at one time was an individual from South Africa who had an NDE. He interviewed him to get an idea about his psychosomatic state, how he felt, etc. And this person, I believe his name was Jack, had a primary nurse who worked with him every day. Her name was Anita. And one day she told him she was going to take a long weekend off and there'd be nurses substituting for her. And while she was gone, he had another respiratory event, which is why he was in the hospital, and had a near-death experience and found himself in a beautiful pastoral scene. And there, to his surprise, was his nurse, Anita. She came walking towards him, and he did a double take and said, "Anita, what are you doing here?" And she said, "Jack, you need to go back. I want you to go and find my parents and tell them I love them very much. And I'm sorry I wrecked the red MGB." Now, this event that Bruce Grayson was telling us occurred back in the 70s in South Africa, and there weren't a lot of MGBs driving around at the time. Now, when Jack awoke in his hospital bed, he started to tell the first nurse what he saw about his experience, and she got very teary-eyed, rushed out of the room, and it turned out that this nurse, Anita, had taken the weekend off to celebrate his 21st birthday, and her parents had surprised her with a gift. You got it, a red MGB. She got so excited, she jumped in the car, took it for a test drive, crashed into a telephone pole, and died instantly at the time that Jack had his NDE. There is no way Jack could have known at the time that she had died, or certainly how she had died, but yet he did. And we now have many cases like this that have been corroborated, veridical perceptions. There are numerous examples of them. That's why neurophysiological explanations can't explain these kinds of incidences. Another compelling veridical perception during a near-death experience was Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon who wrote a bestseller book about his experience. And 4 months after his near-death experience, which included him riding on a butterfly wing with a beautiful woman, and he felt nothing but love from her as the butterfly flew over a pastoral, scenic environment. Yet he couldn't dismiss her love and companionship. But 4 months after his NDE, he received a photograph of his deceased birth sister, Betsy, whom he never had known in life since he was adopted. So to his astonishment, he recognized that the woman in the photograph was actually the same individual who had been with him during his NDE riding on a butterfly's wing. And according to Eben, it was unmistakable. Her loving smile, her confident gaze and sparkling blue eyes. He knew that picture represented the woman who was with him during his near-death experience. The shared death experience was hyper-real. It was as if it was actually happening in real time. I truly felt that I was dying, and I had that intense suffering of not being able to breathe, aligning with my best friend Anita, she's not Anita, Anne at the time, aligning with her respiratory event, because I was told she had a respiratory event which caused her to die. She couldn't breathe, and that's what she was imparting to me, that inability to breathe. She was suffocating, and I felt that suffocation. It was so unmistakably hyper real, unlike any dream I've had as a child, which of course we all have nightmares, but this was unusual in the sense that it was hyper real, more convincing than any other dream that I've ever had. And I'd never received information imparted to me in a dream as I did that Anne shared with me. She was basically saying, Bob, I am dying. She didn't say it. I didn't hear the words. I just had a knowingness that it was her who was dying unexpectedly. Well, science, especially neuroscience, is generally very materialistic, meaning consciousness emerges from the brain. And as an idealist, I believe just the opposite. Consciousness is primary, it's fundamental. Mass, matter emanate from consciousness. But the field of neuroscience is generally materialistic. So they believe that consciousness arises purely from the brain and is not independent of the brain, which I disagree with, as near-death experiences tell us, that consciousness can survive bodily death and exist in another realm. Now, neuroscience, or people who study brain function, they will look at neurotransmitters. They will look at EEG. They will look at brainwave patterns as they have, trying to detect the moment of death, trying to decide what defines clinical death. You see, the question is, how can these people know this information when they're comatose, when they're flatlined with no EKG, no EEG, yet while they're having that near-death experience, they can recount vivid events remote from them. I have many other stories that exemplify just that. They're aware of other existences beyond their location, despite the near-death state that they're in. So neuroscientists are trying to figure out whether or not people can perceive when they're in that near-death state. Are they really near death? Does it really mean, in other words, that they can't retrieve information from elsewhere? Well, of course they can't. They're lying on a bed with their eyes closed, their heart's not beating, with a flat EEG, and yet they still come back with information that's found to be accurate. Now, neuroscientists who are generally materialists will still say it's neurotransmitters that's making the person feel that love, that sense of compassion, and extraordinary peace that people say they feel. They will say that the person is reporting an out-of-body experience because the brain has a glitch resulting from a chaotic brain that's in the process of dying, where the person can't differentiate their internal state from the external world. Thus, they may perceive an out-of-body-like experience. They try, in other words, to apply materialist explanations to an event that miserably fails. They cannot do it. But you can't blame them. They don't believe in life after death. They don't believe that consciousness can be independent of the brain. So they keep on looking for that clinical definition or signature. What clearly defines death? And we don't really have a clear definition of what death is, because people can be revived, even an hour or two after the heart stops, as long as they're being monitored and maintained with resuscitation equipment. So science is behind the ball on this. They can't explain it, and yet they'll say, let philosophy, psychology address it. We're just interested in trying to figure out why they're having these symptoms. But they'll just look for it in a very materialistic perspective. There are over 30 different definitions of consciousness. And if one person says they have the definition, they know what consciousness is, I would say that their ego is showing. No one can truly say what consciousness is. To me, I suspect that it is primary, that mass, matter, and energy are all derivatives of consciousness, and it's information exchange. It's the fabric of the universe. Consciousness exists everywhere, and we see convincing evidence of it existing in the form of information exchange at every level of our physical world. The feeling of what it feels like to be me, the essence of I, that's consciousness. But we see information exchange at all levels of our physical world, as I said, even at the microscopic world. If people, in other words, look at subatomic particles, if you're observing subatomic particles, it acts like a wave. But if you stop observing it, it acts like particles. There's a lot more to the story, but the point is the act of observing subatomic particles as they're entering two open slits is determined by observation, by human observation, and it has a direct impact on the physical system, subatomic particles or photons of light energy. But we also see information exchange occurring between humans and between humans and physical systems in the form of extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. And ESP, extrasensory perception, is valid. I have no doubt about that. Just like the near-death experience, it is real. And we see evidence of consciousness in ESP experiments where people can actually predict about 2 to 4 seconds before a stimuli is presented. They can predict what it is going to be under rigid experimental conditions. Even a review of over 1,000 articles in ESP proved that it is valid, and the American Psychological Association even confirmed it. They believe that ESP is real, and thus consciousness, because when you talk about ESP, we're talking about consciousness. We're talking about a form of energy, probably biophotons or light energy, that emanates from the cells and DNA of the body and can move away from the body as if a torsion wave or a spin force conveys it to other people and elsewhere. So we see this biophotonic activity clearly in humans and in all animals, actually. And we also see consciousness being conveyed via probably biophotonic energy in the Global Consciousness Project. Members of your audience may be familiar with this project, where there were random number generators that give out zeros and ones numbers. So over time, you should get 50% zeros and 50% ones. But during major global events like 9/11, these random number generators that should give you, again, 50% ones, 50% zeros, suddenly became statistically significantly non-random. In other words, it wasn't 50-50. There was a much higher percentage of non-randomness, indicating it wasn't due to chance. The collective attention, the collective consciousness of millions of people focusing on one event, like the horrific events of 9/11, caused these random number generators to become non-random, statistically significant. In fact, we see that happening too with other major worldwide events like the tsunami incident in Indonesia back in, I think it was 03, 04. The election of President Obama also caused these random number generators to become non-random. Now, how can you explain it other than there's something going on here with the consciousness of the collective humanity? When they're focusing attention on one thing, for some reason, it affects physical systems like random number generators. And we see this in many different contexts that we don't have time to address. But you could even say, I'm receiving information now that's allowing me to view you and my external world. Why? Well, light energy is just now entering my visual system, occurring from the Big Bang over, 12.8 billion years ago. That light energy now reaching me is allowing me, that information of light is allowing me to perceive. So many people say that, that's a form of consciousness in the sense of information exchange occurring between an external event and you. Can consciousness be mental intuition or intention, self-awareness, free will, level of alertness, higher order of cognitive functioning? All of these terms are used to define consciousness, and that's why it is very discipline specific. If you ask a physician what is consciousness, they're going to tell you it's a form of wakefulness, a state of being awake. If you ask a philosopher, you're going to get a completely different answer. Probably that consciousness is primary and fundamental, and that all matter derives from consciousness. While panpsychics, that's another type of a definition for consciousness, panpsychism. They'll say all matter, everything is conscious. Even this desk here is conscious. Why? Because if I bang my hand on it, I feel pain. So the desk is telling me don't hit it because I'll sense pain. But you could also say I can make that decision too, not to bang my hand on it to avoid pain. But psychics will even go so far to say that there is consciousness even in inanimate objects. They make a point, but I'm not going to. But I'm an idealist. Consciousness is primary, and for the past 150 years, psychologists and brain researchers and physicists have been concerned with consciousness, and we haven't gotten any closer to the core of this issue, despite the many years of study, despite the thousands of scholars who have addressed the concept of consciousness. We still don't have a clear consensus of what consciousness is, the subjective act of experiencing, which cannot be described in an objective third-person way. Diane Hennessy Powell, the author of the telepathy tapes, is a good friend of mine. In fact, she's in our documentary, The Consciousness Connection, on consciousness.media, which you can view. And we talked to her about her research with autistic savants, whose extraordinary cognitive abilities often surpass those achieved through lifelong practice. And she was turned on to the fact that autistic savants might have ESP when she found, I believe it was a 5-6 year old who is able to calculate cube roots of numbers with over 5 digits, despite lacking basic math skills. I mean, this is a little kid who can't, I never had math lessons, yet is able to compute this mathematical information, which obviously more than surprised her. But what got her attention was when she asked the boy, how are you able to come up with the right answer? A cube root number with over 5 digits. And he comes up with a number that's, completely accurate to the decimal point. And he says, it just comes to me. The answer just pops in my head. And that set her on a quest to conduct research with autistic savants. And without going into any great detail, she was able to display extraordinary ESP skills in children with almost 100% accuracy. They're able to identify. Let's say if you have 5 cards held up in front of the child, all with different numbers or different symbols, the child was able to accurately identified the correct symbol when asked over 80% of the time. 80% accuracy, in other words, when guesswork alone would give you 20% at best, and yet they were giving you anywhere between 80 to 100% accuracy on these types of ESP tests. And this is what's in the telepathy tapes, where she talks about many of these types of experiences. So ESP is real, and we can prove it in autistic savants, and we can even prove it in humans through experimental designs that are well controlled. I'm not a religious person, so I don't have a faith-based belief that there is a life after this life, that consciousness continues beyond bodily death. But after my shared death experience and my Kundalini awakening, after I interviewed many people for my film, The Consciousness Connection, on consciousness.media, it became more apparent to me that it's not ashes to ashes and dust to dust. That's true for the body, but we do likely, I can't say with 100% certainty, but I'll say 95% certain that we do persist after bodily death in some form. And it's the veridical perceptions, or verifiable perceptions, that people relate during the near-death experiences that more than anything else convinces me of that. And I had a taste of it with my shared death experience. Before that, I was more or less 50-50 whether or not there is life after death. After that experience, I more or less moved up to 80% certain that there's life after death. And then after I interviewed many people for the movie, the documentary we put out, The Consciousness Connection, I became even more convinced. I can't be 100% certain, maybe because I'm a scientist and I need, I'm still stuck with that scientific method that I need to prove a hypothesis. So I'm a bit reluctant to say I'm 100% certain, but it's pretty darn close that I am certain that we do persist after bodily death in some realm of existence. Not at all. I have no fear of death, and people, there have been studies done. People who have a near-death experience before death, one study shows that I believe 70-75% feared death, but after their near-death experience, 0% of them experienced fear of death. Other studies show the same thing. 80% who fear death, it goes back to 0. Once you have a near-death experience, these individuals do not fear death anymore. In fact, during many near-death experiences, people don't want to return back to their earthly realm. They want to remain in their so-called heavenly or unearthly realm, unless they're forced to come back, in which case they are, because they live to tell about it. So that third-party corroboration during a veridical perception makes me almost 100% certain that we persist. That and my shared death experience combined. Anne and I were very, very close as colleagues, as friends, and even spiritually. We often talked about life after death and spirituality. And I feel like she purposely wanted to convey to me that information because of our close bond, our affinity for one another. And if anybody would do it, I can see her sharing that experience with me. I'm not certain of why I had a shared death experience, but the fact is I had 3 extraordinary experiences. I saw 2 unidentified aerial phenomena, Sedona, Arizona. I had that shared death experience, and then I had the Kundalini awakening. It's almost as if, I do this to my wife. Somebody's playing with me, because after each of these 3 extraordinary experiences, I wrote a book. And then I wrote my last book, The Consciousness Connection, based on my film, The Consciousness Connection. So it seems to be building up to a crescendo to where I'm being told to enlighten the best I can the masses of what consciousness is, what life is all about, the nature of reality. And that's what I talk about in my book and in the film. I never would have done all that, the writings, the film, if I didn't have these experiences. I'd be playing golf, playing bocce ball, and other things completely different. Never in a million years would I have ever expected myself to be so deeply engaged in research and consciousness studies the way I am, and focusing much of my time and attention to writing about it and working on my film. We're going to do another sequel to The Conscious Connection that's going to focus exclusively on near-death experiences and veridical perceptions. And Gaia.com, a leading video production company, sponsored our film and will likely sponsor the next documentary that I'm working on with Dave Beatty and Wilson Hawthorne. So, yeah, I feel as if I'm almost being played with, as if to give me a purpose in life. Why, I'm not sure. But these kinds of experiences are much more common than people think. If you enter a room and there's 100 people there and you ask the question, who here has had an unusual experience, a paranormal, shall we say, experience that changed your life in a dramatic way, you're going to see a lot of hands being raised if they're being truthful. It is much more common than not for people to have near-death experiences. 200,000 people alone in the United States each year have a near-death experience. Estimated over 32 million people worldwide have had near-death experiences. These are common events, let alone ESP and out-of-body experiences, of which 10 to 15% of people worldwide have had. So these are not random events that occur infrequently. Science is aware of it, but science is not designed to validate it because they don't know how. We don't have the proper tools, the scientific knowledge and technology to actually determine life after death. We don't know for sure. How do you prove that? The only way you can, right now at least, is qualitatively, by looking at what people are saying, the thematic and semantic content of the information that they are sharing about their extraordinary experiences. That, more than anything else, is compelling. But materialistic science doesn't look at these qualitative bits of evidence. They want quantitative, hard scientific facts that are independently verified by other laboratories and researchers before they're convinced of anything else. Don't you see? So the qualitative anecdotal evidence, interesting, falls on deaf ears in terms of the scientists who are materialistic in nature. But that is changing. Many scientists are becoming fed up with materialism and moving to dualism or idealism, that consciousness, in other words, is primary, that consciousness does not emerge from the brain, but is rather independent of the brain. Got most of what I wanted to say out, and thank you for the platform.